Morning. Good, good afternoon for you. It's good morning for me. I'm a retired excuse me. I'm a retired professor of medieval history at something now called Stony Brook University. It's part of the state of New York's university system, and we're on Long Island, about 50 miles east of New York City. And let me say, over the years, I've been to UEA a fair number of times. I had friends on the history faculty, now long retired, as I am. And working on Margaret Paston, I've tramped the region a good deal, including days in the winter when it was so cold that we had to get back to the car and run the heater before we could drive to the next church and all. But we wondered how they lasted through church services. Okay, I'm going to talk to you about Margaret Paston. And these are sort of miscellaneous comments focusing finally on her very interesting will. Margaret Paston lives from about 1420 or early into the 20s until 1484. So she's probably 60 or a tad above by the time of her death. This is not a particularly great age for people at the time. When we talk about medieval demography and longevity, we have to take into account the very high levels of infant mortality and of death through accidents and childbirth and battle and things of that sort. And we think that people who reached early maturity, say in their 20s, had about a 50-50 chance of living to 50 or beyond. So though she's an old lady by the end, she's not sort of the ancient, you might say, crone of East Anglia kind of thing that people would pay to see or something of that sort. You know, tell us about Edward III or King Arthur sort of thing. Okay. In talking about the Pastons with a focus on Margaret, it struck me in trying to organize my thoughts that there are three themes, or you might say three categories of topic that come together. One is the Paston family, into which she marries as a young woman. The second is family letter writing, which is how we know the Pastons and why they've been outstanding for 2.5 centuries already. I'll come back to that very promptly. And lastly, it's Margaret as a matriarch, as a strong woman of a family. The Paston family is an interesting example of a family very much on the make. Coming from sort of dubious background, perhaps just straddling freedom and unfreedom, they have a spectacular rise with a man we call William I, who dies in 1444. He becomes a judge, which is quite a jump for a boy who comes from, say, probably prosperous peasant family in the village of Paston on the northeast coast of Norfolk and all. And he marries well, he marries an heiress, and he has a bunch of children. The most prominent, the man who carries on the family, is his oldest son, John I, who marries our Margaret in the early 1440s and who dies probably of the plague in 1466. We'll come back to John I. The Pastons are a peculiar and not terribly pleasant family. For many years, one of the reasons that people had a very dim view of England in the 15th century is because they knew the world through the Paston letters. And the Pastons are not a particularly pleasant bunch. If they'd been a sweeter, more amiable, less ambitious and so forth, we might have had a nicer view of the whole century. That's all changed now. There's an immense amount of research on every aspect of the 15th century. But until after the Second World War, it was rarely touched by major scholars. And it was this kind of black hole into which you shoveled the Pastons. I'll come back to a little of that in a few minutes. There are a couple generalizations about the family, and then I'll move on. Okay. Through marriage and service, they hope to be the heirs of the estates of John Fastolf. Fastolf had been a commander in the 100 Years' War, and he came back to England a very rich man. And the Pastons served him. He did not have a direct male heir, and they hoped that they would be the heirs of his huge estate. Ultimately, they got part of it. Some of it went to found Magdalen College at Oxford, and some of it fell into other hands. But this desire to get the wealth that they hoped would come to them you might say, emphasizes their nastiness, their social climbing, their political double dealing, their sucking up to the local aristocracy, and a number of actual sieges and fights that they engage in, some quite serious, some deadly. Several of their retainers are actually killed in one of the sieges of one of their manor houses. So inheriting from Falstaff, you might say, is the main agenda item of the Pastons from about 1460 pretty much through the end of the century, where they have mixed luck. Another characteristic of the family, and I'll come back to this later on with Margaret, is that unlike many families on the make, they don't have a single burial site or a family church. Though ultimately, Margaret and her husband rebuild the church of St. Peter Hungate in Norwich, the family burial sites are scattered. And you might say, if you want to establish yourself as a nouveau family with a real claim to honor and age and prestige and so forth, a common burial site would seem the way to go. William I, the judge, is buried in the Lady Chapel of Norwich Cathedral. That's a very prestigious burial site and indicates of how successfully he jumped over social and political barriers. His oldest son, John I, is buried at Bromholm, or was buried at Bromholm Priory. Margaret, we'll come back to Margaret, is buried in her family's little church at Montby, down the coast from the Paston lands. And the rest of them are scattered. Margaret's mother-in-law, Agnes Paston, tried to convince the family to be buried in the Carmelite church in Norwich. She had mixed success. There are a couple burials there, but not very many. A number of them who died in London are buried in the Blackfriars Church in London. Now, ironically, there are none of these sites still extant as they were in the 15th century. The Carmelite Church in Norwich is just a stone arch. It's all that's left of it. The Chantry Chapel that Margaret devotes much attention and money to in the parish church at Montby disappeared at some time. We don't know when. Pavsner's Buildings of England simply says it was there and it isn't anymore. The Lady Chapel of the Cathedral, where William I was buried, disappeared. Probably around the year 1600, it was secretly dismantled, probably for building stones, which were used in other constructions, the way the Colosseum in Rome was dismantled by nearby property developers. Bromholm Priory, of course, is gone, long gone, a casualty of Reformation. It's possible that a coffin in the Church of St. Peter Hungate holds the body of John I, Margaret's husband, it being moved there sometime when Bromholm Priory was dismantled. But nobody's taken it apart or done a DNA test and so forth. So though the Pastons are a climbing family with a number of common agendas that sort of hold them together, they don't have the common burial site that we might expect. And none of these physical remains are there to be seen if you're really interested in making a Paston memorial pilgrimage kind of thing. I don't think well, if you're going to do it in nice weather. Okay, so my first theme, you might say, is the Paston family, into which Margaret marries. And I'll come back to that in a couple of minutes. The second one is the theme of family letters. By the 15th century, people in England who had any level of, you might say, prosperity or stability were literate. Firstly, of course, in English. And if they had more education, it might run to French or possibly, for men at least, to Latin. But we have a number of family letter collections from the 15th century. The Paston letters are the biggest collection, the most useful in terms of historical information, and they're the best known. But we also have family letter collections of the Seeley family, having to do with the wool trade and the staple, the Stoner family, which centers around the Thames Valley, and the Plumpton family, which takes us to the politics of the Northeast in the later 15th century. So there's no reference to other such family collections, and there's no particular reference to the fact that certain families wrote and preserved their letters. But nevertheless, we have these, at least these, we have these 4 sets. It's unlikely anything else is apt to show up at this point and all. One of the, and I have some statistics about the Paston letters. Okay, one of the interesting characteristics of the Paston letters, or of, you might say, my central figure, Margaret, is that there not only are a great many letters, but that a great many are written by Margaret herself. The letters have drawn considerable attention for a long time. And I discovered I have the second edition of them. They were first published in 1777 by a man named John Fenn, who dedicated the volume to George III and eventually got knighted for his efforts. I discovered yesterday in lining stuff up that I have an edition published 10 years later in 1787. And then around the turn of the last century, around the 1890s into the early 1900s, James Gardner edited them a number of times, and finally in 3 small volumes. And today, in what will remain the definitive edition, in the 1970s, Norman Davis of Oxford did 2 volumes of the letters. It's huge. Fenn and Gardner did them chronologically, as one would expect. For reasons that are not particularly clear, Norman Davis, in what's now the definitive edition that everyone uses, sorted them out by letter writer, and then in the second volume by recipient. This makes it easy to study the development, you might say, and the career of Margaret, though if you want to mesh her with the letters to and from her husband and then her sons, you have to go back and forth, which isn't terribly hard to do. The notes in the volume enable you. Nevertheless, they are easily accessible. The English is pretty easy to read. It's not very different by the late 15th century from our English and all. I'd say it's much more familiar than Chaucer. And also, not being a literary creation, the vocabulary is smaller and simpler and all. There are a lot of these letters. In volume 1 of Norman Davis's edition, he has the Pastons wrote 421 of them. These come from 11 men and 4 women. And of the 4 women, Margaret is by far the most prolific. She writes 104 letters. And in the second volume, which is letters received by the Pastons, he has about the same number, 444 letters, 29 of them written to Margaret. I say written. We're pretty sure that Margaret dictates her letters. She doesn't actually write them herself. Women could read. Reading and writing are actually separate skills, though we bracket them cognitively, and we teach children at what the ages of 5 or 6 or 7 or something to read and write, and we teach them at the same time. But these are actually separate skills. And we think that the women of the time, even upper class women with a good deal of education, didn't do much actual writing. They rarely set, you might say, quill to paper. And the letters are on paper, not on parchment and all. But nevertheless, Margaret moves in the world of literacy without much trouble and so forth. It's an educated family. There's an inventory of books. There are references to books. Some of the kids are sent to university and so forth. So Margaret's moving in a world where reading and sending letters is a very sort of commonplace kind of activity, though she's very active in this. Okay, let me move a bit on to Margaret herself and all. As I said, she lives to be probably into her early 60s, though for the last 18 years, she's a widow. Her life follows the usual sort of bracketing of a woman's life. She's a maiden, then she marries John Paston, and I'll read you an excerpt about that in a minute. Then she becomes a mother, then she becomes a widow, and finally, towards the end of a longish widowhood, she retreats or retires from the family's manor houses and activity, and more or less retires to an old manor house of her own back in Maltby, where she spends her last years, sort of tired of the endless, you might say, Paston problems kind of thing, and so forth. No. She is the heiress of 2 lines, actually, so she's a very good catch. What I mean by that, that is her mother was an heiress and brought estates and wealth to the Maltby family, and then Margaret, I'm sorry. And then Margaret, as an only child, will bring the Maltby inheritance to her husband, as indeed she does. When she's in her late teens or early 20s, it's time for her to marry. Among people of property, an arranged marriage was a standard affair. It was not looked upon as the loss of freedom or some kind of domineering interference from the previous generation. There are love matches, and we have several in the Paston family, a generation or 2 on. We'll come back to those eventually. But that Margaret, as an arranged marriage, is perfectly reasonable. When I used to lecture on this kind of stuff to Stony Brook undergraduates, I would refer them on the idea that they were probably familiar with Romeo and Juliet, which is after written a little over a century after the Paston business. But it reflects a traditional view of upper-class marriage. Remember, Juliet is now about 14, and her father says, I'll arrange a marriage for you. And she says, fine, do a good job. And he comes back and says, you're engaged to somebody called the County Paris. And she says, that's great, but I'm only 14 and I haven't met him. Can we put the wedding off for a little bit? And her father says, fine, no problem. Then she goes to the dance and she sees Romeo, and of course, romance blossoms. And what you have, in a sense, is the tension between conventional upper-class marriage and romantic upper-class marriage, and then plays out the tragedy of Romeo and Juliet and all. But Margaret does not go to the dance and does not see a Romeo with whom she falls instantly in love for some reason or other. And she seems perfectly happy to marry John Paston and all, who's probably a couple years older than she is, but a young man, probably just turned 20 or so. We don't have any comment from Margaret herself about this, but her mother-in-law to be, Agnes Paston, reports to Agnes's husband, John's father, William I, the judge. And she tells him that the young people met and seemed to get along very well. Around 1440, she says, and I'll read this in modernized English, as for the first acquaintance between John Paston and the said gentlewoman, she made him good cheer in gentle wise, and said he was verily your son. And so I hope there need be no great treaty between them. That is, this marriage, they seem happy with the marriage, and we can arrange the details without undue negotiation. And the marriage takes, and it will last from the early 1440s until John dies in 1466. We'll come back to that and all. Okay, they get married, and I'm trying to find. So Margaret begins to do her duty. That is, she begins to produce children, and they eventually have 7 children who survive infant mortality and go on to various fates and all. In the course of her first pregnancy, when John is away from home, and it's his being away from home that generates most of the letters. But early in her first pregnancy, when John is away from home, she says, quote, you have left me such remembrance that makes me think of you both day and night when I would sleep and all. This is a young woman in her first pregnancy, clearly not sleeping comfortably on her stomach anymore. And in that pregnancy or the next one, she says that the midwife, who was going to be there to help her when her time came, has had an attack of sciatica. But the midwife says she'll be there when she's needed, even if they have to bring her in a wheelbarrow and all. Well, the years pass and Margaret produces children. And if in the early 1440s, she wrote to her husband in a jocular fashion and said, you've left me such a souvenir that I remember you day and night. By 10 years later, she signed the letter, by your groaning wife, MP, kind of thing, the novelty of pregnancy, and obviously worn off, though they keep having children for some years now. So Margaret plays the role, sorry, and this generates the letters. Margaret plays the role of the stay-at-home wife, obviously. The men, as they grow up, her husband and then her sons wander around doing various forms of legal business, political business, ingratiating themselves with Fastolf, quarreling with the neighbors, and so on and so forth. So Margaret at home becomes the clearinghouse for family business. And we have the letters because she gets instructions from her husband, and then she keeps in touch with her husband, and then later with her sons. She also is running a large household with a lot of kids. We know nothing about the actual size of the household or the amount of staff it had or the amount of work to provision it. We do get letters from Margaret. Margaret writes letters to her husband and later to her older sons about shopping in London. Even though Norwich is probably the third or fourth or fifth city of the kingdom, there's stuff you can get in London that you either can't get in Norwich or you can get for a better price in London. So we have letters where she details them to buy cloth, so for the sewing at home, or sometimes food and spices to keep the household provisioned and all. We know from other studies that an upper class household could run to several dozen people and feed huge numbers of meals. We have no Paston information on this. We have one very amusing letter where John, her husband, has been told to shop for the kids' clothing in London, and he buys the wrong sizes. He clearly doesn't know the age or size of his own kids. You might say it reflects the division of labor in a household and so forth. Why would he do that? There are only, 4 or 5 of his children, and he may not. Well, they named the oldest son John. We call him John II. And the next son is also named John. We call him John III. So, their focus on the kids as individuals, you might say, is not as intense as it would be in a modern family, at least without the need for some therapy on that over identity crises. So anyway, Margaret runs the household, and she does this for many years and so forth. One of the things of interest about Margaret is her conventional piety. And there's a very nice little book called Margaret Paston's Piety. I know it's a nice book because I wrote it. And we could look at things like the number of saints' festival dates that she uses to date her letters. She dates most of her letters, and she's very much given to reading off the saint's day at the opening. She rarely uses a secular date when she can say something like written on Twelfth Night, or written on the feast of St. Hilary, or St. Agnes, or the conversion of St. Paul, or the purification of the Virgin, or St. Valentine, or St. Matthew the Apostle, or the second Sunday of Lent, and so on and so forth. It shows a familiarity, obviously, with the festivals of the late medieval church. And it shows a level of late piety, which I think is intense, but without the kind of enthusiasm that draws so many students today to the crazy ravings of Margaret Kemp or to the serious reflections of Julian of Norwich and so forth. I think it's good conventional piety of that world. They're, you might say, upper middle class or lower aristocratic people, very much part of their conventional world. They don't question its values, its boundaries. They live within them, though they push. Okay, Margaret in 1466 becomes a widow. John had been in London, he'd been in some trouble. He seems to be clearing himself from the trouble, and he dies of the plague. And eventually, his body is brought home in a very elaborate ceremony, which I'll come back to briefly. And she's a widow with a whole bunch of still unmarried children. So it's a heavy loss, a heavy blow. None of her many letters reflect the life crises at times like this. So we just have to accept that the news came to her, and whatever personal pain it brought, she has to soldier on. and she does so. And she becomes a more or less a dutiful mother, helping to launch her children out into the world and so forth, with some difficulty. I'll come back to this when we come to her will. In the late 1470s, when she's clearly aging and she'd been ill, we think, seriously ill around 1480, she leaves the Paston. The Pastons at this point have they have a house in Norwich on Elm Hill and a number of manor houses in the country. She goes back to her original, you might say, family manor house at Maltby, and she lives out her last years there. And in 1482, knowing that mortality is soon going to catch up with her, she writes a will, though she lasts until the autumn of 1494. And it's a very, very interesting will, because I think, in a sense, let me find my own notes to myself. In a sense, it's an autobiographical will. That is, she sees her life as a series of segments, and the will proceeds serially from its opening through its closing to deal with the different segments of her life. It's a longish will. It's about 4 or 5 pages, as it's printed in Norman Davis's edition of the Paston letters and so forth. It's in English. It's dictated, of course, not written by Margaret's own hand. And it very much is an indication that, at least late in life, she falls back very heavily on her original identity as the heiress, the heir of the Maltby family. They were older and much better established than the Pastons. And though there are not many references to her family heritage in her letters that we have, mind you, we don't know what other letters she might have written, but when she comes towards the very end, she's living back in Maltby, and the will really reconfirms her Maltby identity as much or more as her Paston identity. It's a kind of interesting flashback on how an elderly widow with a lot of troublesome children sees her life and so forth. Okay, let me move to her will, which is a very interesting kind of autobiographical document. She opens in the conventional fashion. I want to be buried in Maltby Parish Church. It's her family thing. And she leaves money for the building of a chantry, a new aisle, which, as I say, seemingly was built, but has completely disappeared. And if you go to Maltby Church today, there's nothing but, you might say, but a scar on the outside wall in what would be the southeast corner of the existing parish church, where the chantry had been. She asks for a tomb, which she subsidizes, of course. She's a wealthy woman. She asks for a tomb, and on the 4 corners of the tomb, she indicates which coats of arms there are to be. And this is interesting because one coat of arms is a mix of Paston and Maltby. And she says, I am Margaret Paston, wife of John Paston. But the other 3 corners, the arms that she bears, are not the Pastons at all. One of them is the Burneys of Redham. That's her mother's family. And she'd been born at Redham. We'll come back to that in a minute and all. It bears the arms of that family. The 3rd corner bears the arms of Maltby and Sir Roger Beauchamp. He's a minor member of the Beauchamp family, but a figure of some prominence in the 14th and 15th century, you might say, compared to the Pastons. And the 4th corner is the arms of the Maltbys and Lord Loven, another minor courtier at the time of Edward III, and so forth. So she's saying, in a sense, my family can beat your family, and we're going to show it on the tomb. And in the middle of the tomb, it just simply is to say the Margaret Paston and the Maltby arms and all. So in a sense, she doesn't deny the Paston marriage, but she minimizes it, you might say. And her permanent memorial, long gone and disappeared now, but what she thought was her permanent memorial pays a passing dip to the Pastons and a much stronger obeisance to her family by birth. We might call her maiden identity. It's kind of interesting. It's in some ways it's a denial. She's going to counter that later in the will, when she comes to bequest to her current family. But it's an interesting way to start. And then, excuse me. Then, and she leaves the appropriate stuff to the church at Montby to pay for the tomb and for prayers for 12 years of tapers, and 7 years of tapers, and the usual kind of thing, and torches and gowns for the poor people who will march in the funeral procession and that kind of thing. And she even leaves money so the church can buy a couple of service books. So if they're not sure how to pray for her, they'll get a how to do it book that will tell them how to do it. Then, still keeping with the Montby identity, she moves through a number of villages that were clearly her inheritance, so they'll now be part of the Paston estate and all. And she goes through 6 of these villages, leaving small bequests to the church and small bequests in the neighborhood of sixpence or eightpence or a shilling to each family of her tenants in that village. She's clearly the lord, the lady of those villages from her Montby or her Burney inheritance, and she leaves something to the tenants. And when she gets to read them, she says, "There as I was born." I find that sort of a very poignant memory of an old lady looking back on a long and sometimes difficult life and so forth. And she leaves them more money than she did to the other villages, 5 marks to the parish church, and money to the families of the tenants therein. So it's a kind of it's a 3-chapter will, as I put it. And the first chapter is Margaret before or while being a Paston, but not really a Paston. The second part is Margaret as a great lady in the city of Norwich, where the Pastons had one of their houses and where she lived for off and on for many years and so forth. And this too is wholly, you might say, Paston free. It's simply about Norwich. And she leaves money to the 4 friaries of Norwich and the friaries of, evidently early morning lecturing is harder. She leaves money to the friaries of Norwich and of Yarmouth, and then she singles out various churches in Norwich, St. Peter Hungate, which the family had rebuilt, St. Michael Coslany, which was a children's science museum a few years ago, though I think that's been dismantled now, and so forth. But more things. There are anchoresses, people who wall themselves in for pious purposes at various gates of the city. She leaves small bequests to them. She leaves small bequests to the lepers. She leaves money to the Hospital of St. Giles, still functioning, somewhere behind the cathedral, I believe. And she leaves money to each of the residents of the hospital, as well as the institution. She leaves money to each household in the parish of St. Peter Hungate. So they not only rebuilt the parish church there, where some of them had been buried, though there's no, they've been moved around and it's hard to know where. She not only leaves money to the church of St. Peter Hungate, but she leaves to each household in the parish a fair amount of money to be divided up and so forth. So she runs through and she leaves something to the cathedral, what she calls the mother church, where her father-in-law had been buried long before. So she runs through the various, some at least, of the ecclesiastical institutions of Norwich itself. And all, you might say she's playing the great lady of the town. And only now, for what I call chapter 3, does she move to her family, the people you normally would expect to be major recipients of her bequests, of her estate. And this finally is the case. You know, she'd had a difficult time with her children in terms of their marital prospects or careers or futures. Her oldest son, John I, never married. He'd gotten involved in an engagement, and to break it, because either he or the woman didn't want to go through it, they eventually had to go to Rome and pay a good deal of money to have it dissolved. He leaves, and she leaves a bequest. He leaves an illegitimate daughter, but no indication of the daughter's mother. Her second son, John, who will eventually carry on the family, late in Margaret's life, fell in love with a woman named Marjorie Booz. And that's a love match. We have a Valentine written by the wife, and Margaret and her son's mother-in-law to be agreed on that marriage, and that was arranged, and that proceeded and produced the children who will continue the Paston line at least into the 17th or 18th century, and so forth. Her daughters were problematic. Her daughter, Marjorie, fell in love. I'm sorry, I can't remember if I'm doing. I get the damn children mixed up. Her daughter fell in love with the family steward, Richard Call. This is terribly déclassé. After all, daughters of a prosperous family are valuable assets in terms of making political and economic marriages. And by falling in love with the family steward, she's not only married beneath her, as her brothers will comment, but she's, you might say, minimized her value on the marriage market. Margaret and her mother-in-law, Agnes, old John the First, very old mother by this point, are really upset by this. And they go to the Bishop of Norwich and they try to have the engagement or whatever it is dissolved. And the bishop calls the two parties, the daughter and Richard Call, before him separately, and he quizzes them on their level of commitment. And they've evidently gone, you might say, so far in their commitment to each other that he cannot dissolve it, and they don't want to dissolve it. So they are married, and the daughter is, in effect, read out of the family. And we never have another reference to her, though there will be a reference to her children in her mother's will. The other daughter seems to have had a serious flirtation with one of the Paston hangers-on or servants or something, but they thwart that, and she makes a good marriage with the grandson of a judge. So it's a tricky business, marrying your kids. I would say keep out of it, but obviously, if you're upper class gentry in the 15th century, you don't want to keep out of it. And she has very mixed success, or very little success, you might say, in doing it. So in her will, it's her last chance, you might say, to forgive, if not to forget. And furthermore, because she had not been living in one of the Paston households, but in her own in Maltby, it's the breaking up of the household. So there's going to be the distribution of a lot of household goods, which she details at some length in the will. I won't bother to read you about the hangings and the kitchen stuff and the used garments and the bed linen and that kind of stuff that medieval wills often list in interesting but rather tedious detail. And she goes through that. But she does deal with her children and to some extent with her grandchildren and all. Her son Edmund is married to Catherine, and they come in for bequests, and their son Robert gets all of her swans, sort of mysterious bequest for what it's worth. Her daughter Anne, who married well, that is into Judge Yelverton's grandson, gets a lot of household possessions. And Margaret says, I promised them some money when they got married, and it's time to pay it out of the money, the residue of the estate, and so forth. Her son William, there's still a fair number of living children. Her son William gets money, but she says, and he's to get it from the various lands they own. But here's an interesting twist. He's not to get it until he supervised the building of her chantry chapel at Maltby Church. What's lurking behind that is when her husband, John the First died in 1466. He died in London, and he wanted to be buried, or he was buried, at Bromholm Priory on the coast of Norfolk, to the southeast of Norwich. They had a very elaborate procession, bringing the body accompanied by mourners and so forth from London to Bromholm, stopping a number of times along the way and having subsidizing services in each of the churches where the body reposed for a night or two. And when they got to Norwich, before it went on to Baumholm, they threw a very fancy funeral dinner where they invited a lot of people and brought in sort of slaughtered animals and had such a to-do that they had to take some of the windows off the hall at the end to clear the smoke. And her sons, John II and John III, never built the tomb, never got around to the effort or the money to build their father's tomb. And this is a constant sore spot with Margaret and her mother-in-law, Agnes. And my guess, and there's no reference as such, my guess is the boys said, we spent enough on bringing Dad's body to Baumholm. He can lie under a fairly simple tomb. And if the coffin now in St. Peter Hungate is indeed that of John I, they were right. A simple tomb did the job. But I think they just decided they spent enough on Dad. And what resources they had, they would use to further their own careers, which they do quite successfully. But anyway, so the upshot is that William, Margaret's son, is not to get his share of her estate until he's built that chantry at Montby Church. She's taking no chances this time. She's holding, you might say, the stick before the carrot in this case. He presumably did build it, say it does seem to have existed at one point, you know. Then she comes to her son, John, who will be her executor. This is John III, John II having died 5 years before, probably of the plague and so forth. And again, there's lots of household stuff for them. And there's a good deal of money for their children, 100 marks. And this is done with the usual medieval proviso. It goes to child A, and if child A dies before reaching a certain age, or before, if it's a daughter, before marrying, it goes to child B. And if child B dies before, it goes to C. And if there's no child D, then just spend it for my soul. And this is what she does for her son. Then she comes to John II's bastard daughter, Constance, and there's no beating around the bush. She refers to her as John's bastard daughter. There's no equivocation about that. But she leaves her 10 marks, not a lot of money, £6, 13 and 6 or 8, whatever. She leaves her 10 marks when she reaches age 20, which is again a standard thing for underage heirs and so forth. Then she comes to the children of her daughter Marjorie, the one who married Richard Call. Since there's no further reference to Marjorie after they run her out of the family, it's generally assumed that she's dead before Margaret dies in 1484. But there are children, and there are 3 of them in the will. And this time it's £20, not a fortune, but you might say significant help and all. It's £20 when the eldest son reaches age 24. He's older, you might say a little more social control is being exercised over him as the unwanted grandson of an unblessed marriage and so forth. He has 2 younger brothers, a William and a Richard and all. So Marjorie's marriage with Richard Call presumably worked. They ran her out of the family. They couldn't do without Richard Call. He was too important in their business dealings, and he figures in letters after the daughter disappears. But the marriage lasted and produced 3 children. Then she moves a little bit more and all. I was surprised the first time I read this in what I consider uncharacteristic generosity, because I think of Margaret's fairly penny pinching or tight-fisted woman. She says that because the household at Montby is going to be disbanded, no one's going to live there from the Paston family, the staff should be kept on for half a year. They shouldn't be thrown out in the cold, and they'll get an extra quarter year's wages and all, which is a very nice touch at the very end. And then the residue of the estate will be divided equally among the living children, Edmund, William, Anne. John III, the oldest living child, will be the executor. And then a final mysterious touch. John is the head executor, and there are three others who are otherwise completely unknown in the Paston correspondence. Local lawyers, friends of the family, chaplains, we have no idea. So it's John III and three other men. John gets an extra 10 pounds as the head executor, and the others get 5 marks each. And so ends the long and interesting and often difficult career of Margaret Maltby Paston. Okay, thank you.